They called security before she even had the chance to speak. No shouting, no threats, just two security officers emerging from behind the check-in counter, walking straight toward a black woman standing in the priority line held calmly in her hand, an electronic first-class ticket confirmed the night before. She hadn't caused a disturbance. She hadn't cut in line. She was standing there quietly composed like any other traveler. And yet the first words she heard were, "Ma'am, please step this way." No name check, no glance at the ticket, not even a polite, "Can I help you?" Only a sweeping glance over her, like scanning an item that didn't belong on the shelf. And that was enough. Around her, a few curious glances turned her way, not out of outrage, but confirmation. They looked at her, then at each other, as if they had reached the same silent conclusion: she doesn't belong in this line. Not with that skin, not with that hair, not with the way she stood there, too calm, too unapologetic. Naomi Carter didn't react. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to, because this wasn't the first time. She knew how the system worked. She knew the selective politeness. The smiles were never meant for faces like hers. Knew how people avoid your eyes, not because you did something wrong, but because they've decided you are what's wrong. She knew this would happen. She had waited for it. Naomi held out her ticket without speaking, without flinching, presenting it precisely when she had to. The officer took it, glanced at it, then looked to the check-in agent. A silent nod passed between them like a covert signal. And in that moment, the truth unraveled quietly. They didn't need a reason, only a vague sense that she didn't fit. Meanwhile, a white man in a business suit strolled past through the same priority gate with no ID and no backpack, no verification. He merely smiled, and that was enough to earn trust. Naomi watched him not with envy or bitterness, just quiet acknowledgement. Because today, she wasn't here to travel. She was here to observe. To confirm a hypothesis long buried beneath phrases like accidental, system error, and just policy. And if things unfolded as she anticipated, by the end of this flight, no one would be allowed to call her unfit ever again. Naomi stood about a step away from the priority lane. It is not close enough to draw attention, and it is not far enough to be irrelevant. She knew even that small distance could change how people saw a black woman in a space traditionally reserved for blatant wealth and white skin. The clock struck 5:43 a.m. The sky outside was still dark, but the airport glared brightly. The coffee hadn't begun to smell rich, but the fluorescent lights had already imposed their urgent, indifferent, tightly controlled rhythm. Naomi wore a navy hoodie, plain jeans, and slightly worn sneakers. Her hair was tied back in a low, neat ponytail, with no flair or statement. Slung over her shoulder was a canvas tote bag that had accompanied her on countless flights. There was no brand logo or glossy zippers, just a bag simple, quiet, and easily misjudged like her. And of course, misjudgment was already happening. The agent standing at the front of the priority line glanced at her. A quick look, but far from harmless. His name tag read Brandon. Brandon's smile was the kind crafted in hospitality training, polite enough to avoid complaints and shallow enough to be forgettable. "Good morning," he said, tilting his head. "This area is reserved for first-class and executive platinum members." His voice was soft, but with that velvet-covered stiffness of suspicion. Naomi didn't react. She opened her phone and displayed her electronic ticket. The screen glowed green, and seat 2A was unmistakably shown. "I know," she replied. Brandon took a longer than necessary look at the ticket, his eyes lingering on the name, before flicking back to her face as though still hoping to spot something out of place. After a silent breath through the eyes, he nodded. "Yes, that's correct. Please proceed." No error in tone, no offense in expression. But Naomi knew this wasn't acknowledgement. It was a silent concession. Behind her, a middle-aged white man in a blazer furrowed his brow as she walked past. AirPods in finger, gliding over a smartwatch. He said nothing, but his subtle headshake said everything. She doesn't look like a first-class passenger. Naomi kept walking, quiet, unapologetic. She didn't need anyone to validate her place. Brandon leaned toward his colleague, muttering under his breath, "I thought she was at the wrong gate." The other man chuckled, not with humor, but with confidence in his assumption. Naomi heard it all. She didn't react. She was used to it. Used to whispers designed to be audible but not challengeable. Used to glances that carried no words but full loads of judgment. And more importantly, she was prepared to show them all that it comes at a cost. At security, the pattern repeated. Her ticket had TSA pre-check, meaning no shoe removal and no invasive search. But a different agent, a white woman around 40, signaled her toward the secondary inspection table this time. "Random check," the woman said without making eye contact. Her tote bag was open. Items removed included lip balm, a book, a charger, and a small bottle of hand sanitizer. But the woman's eyes paused on a thick sealed envelope stamped with an embossed seal. "What is this? Legal documents. Are you an attorney?" "Not exactly," Naomi answered calmly. The woman turned the envelope over in her hands. Curiosity mingled with suspicion in her gaze. After a few seconds, she nodded, repacked the items, and waved Naomi on. Naomi left the table, adjusted her bag strap, eyes forward, as though none of it had just happened. But she remembered every second. At gate C9, Naomi chose a seat in the corner, not to hide, but to remain unblocked as she observed. No scrolling, no calls. She quietly opened her tote and pulled out the envelope. She didn't open it, just rested it on her lap. Inside was something only 3 people in the country knew the content of: the finalized merger approval documents for the 2 largest transport conglomerates in North America. And the final signatory is required to confirm it all was Naomi Carter. Gate C9 was so quiet that it felt like every sound had been filtered through soft carpet and warm ambient light. The passengers around Naomi slipped into their familiar roles, typing on laptops, dragging rolling suitcases, and making phone calls loud enough to broadcast their busyness. Being busy meant power, and it was the most acceptable reason to exist in this space. Naomi wasn't busy. She sat still, back straight, hands resting on the sealed envelope in her lap, like it was sacred. Her eyes quietly observed, not prying, not defensive, just noting every subtle cue, the timing of a smile from a gate agent, how they laughed with the suited man in row 1, and how they never once looked her way. She had flown enough to know service is stratified, just like the seats in the air. And sometimes you don't need to be denied. You only need to be forgotten. The loudspeaker announced boarding for Group 1. Naomi rose with a few others, primarily men in expensive jackets, noise-cancelling headphones around their necks, their eyes indifferent to the world. One of them, with salt and pepper hair and a cashmere sweater, glanced at Naomi with a flick of the eyes, then looked at the gate agent, silently asking, "Is she in the wrong line?" Naomi didn't return the glance. She handed her ticket to the agent, a young woman named Kelsey, who was in her mid-20s. Kelsey didn't smile, didn't engage. She looked up, once glanced at Naomi, then dropped her eyes to the screen, expression unchanged. "Ma'am, Group 1 is for first class and executive platinum only." "Seat 2A, Naomi replied, offering her ticket. Her voice wasn't raised or soft, just clear. Kelsey scanned the code and nodded without a second look. "You may board." Each step Naomi took down the jet bridge echoed like taps on a conference table, steady, deliberate, not demanding attention, but refusing to be ignored. On board, she found her seat 2A by the window. A man was already seated in 2B's, locked on his tablet. Naomi nodded slightly, sat, and placed her tote under the seat in front. The envelope remained in her hand, then was carefully tucked into the seat pocket, a silent reminder it was here and mattered more than any judgment floating through this cabin. The flight attendant Sloane passed by. Her eyes skimmed across the row. She paused for a beat at Naomi's seat, long enough to register her presence, fast enough not to greet. Sloane smiled at row 1, bowed slightly to offer warm towels to row 3. She skipped Naomi's seat. Naomi stared out the window. She wasn't surprised. This was what she had anticipated. Discrimination by omission. A few minutes later, the beverage cart rolled down from the front of the cabin. Sloane led and an assistant followed. Each passenger was asked, "What would you like?" The tone was cheerful, even gentler with elderly passengers. When they reached Naomi, the tone changed, more procedural, flatter. "Ma'am, sorry, beverage service isn't included with your fare." Naomi turned. Even in first class. It wasn't a challenge, just a statement of fact. Sloane glanced at her list. Her eyes flickered with brief confusion, then reset to neutral. "I'll check with the cabin manager." No apology, no clarification, just a conditional retreat, as if Naomi had erred by asking. The man beside her leaned in and whispered, "I thought drinks were complimentary in first class." Naomi didn't answer, because everything was unfolding exactly as she had expected. In the coming hours, Naomi would be double-checked on her seat assignment, asked to move for weight distribution, served her meal late and cold, and flagged internally with a behavior code for being non-cooperative. But she wouldn't get angry, wouldn't protest, wouldn't ask why anymore. She would keep observing, because she knew that everything they were doing now, every seemingly harmless gesture, would soon appear in the report of a high-level investigation. And this time, she would be the one writing the judgment. The first-class cabin shimmered under soft lighting, the hum of the engines, and a carefully curated civility that felt more like stagecraft than sincerity. Everything was designed for comfort and privilege, except how Naomi felt. She sat still, in seat 2A beside the window. The envelope still resting in the seat pocket was evidence no one cared about, but one that could upend the entire structure when the time came. Sloane passed again with the warm towel tray. Row 1, fragrant towels, neatly folded, offered with greetings. Row 3, warm towels, a smile, and a polite, "Can I get you anything else?" Row 2, Naomi's row, no glance, no question, no towel, nothing. The man in 2B looked awkwardly at Naomi and then toward the attendant about to speak, but stopped. He had seen enough to know something was wrong, but not enough courage to interrupt the script. Naomi said nothing. She just remembered. She brushed her finger gently against the corner of the envelope in the seat pocket, as if to remind herself that she was still in control. Later, the lunch cart came out. Sloane stopped at the row ahead, politely describing each meal: miso-glazed cod, herb-roasted chicken, organic grain salad. She took notes with a silver pen, skipping no one. Then she passed Naomi's row as if seat 2A did not exist. Naomi waited. 3 rows behind her had their meals. She hadn't been asked. She didn't ring the call button. She just waited for the moment. And then, as Sloane came back down the aisle with drinks again, Naomi spoke gently. "Was I skipped for meal service?" Sloane paused, face pretending to access a memory, then feigned surprise. "Oh, I wasn't sure you had placed an order." "I'm seated in first class." Naomi looked straight at her, not angry, not bitter, just clear. Sloane nodded slowly and looked at the manifest, this time with exaggerated diligence, as if performing thoroughness to cover a mistake. "Right. Would you prefer the cod or the chicken?" "Cod," Naomi replied, not looking at her. 15 minutes later, the tray arrived. Cold. The fish was slightly raw, the vegetables wilted, and the rice clumped like glue. Naomi didn't eat. She closed the lid and pushed the tray forward. Without a word, across the aisle a passenger gestured for another glass of wine. With a glance, the attendant appeared immediately. Naomi wasn't jealous. She took note. Not long after, a man in khakis and expensive headphones stepped up from the rear cabin, leaned on the headrest of Naomi's seat, and said loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "She's in first class." He didn't look at Naomi. The question wasn't meant for her. It was launched into the air like an accusation disguised as curiosity. Sloane nearby gave a soft chuckle, nodding toward Naomi. "She's on the list. Probably used reward points or something." The man laughed, tapped the headrest twice, like testing a public object, then returned to his seat. Naomi still didn't react. She didn't let anger rise. She held it in its original form, purpose. When the cabin began preparing for descent, Sloane returned with faux politeness. "Ma'am, please store your bag in the overhead bin. It's for safety compliance." Naomi met her gaze. "I've flown before, I know." Sloane didn't respond. She turned away. This time, Naomi touched the envelope in her lap. Inside it were documents verifying Naomi as the final approver on a $4.1 billion merger deal. Authorization for her to anonymously audit premium service operations. Access codes to monitor frontline staff behavior. They thought she didn't belong here. She didn't just belong. She held the power to decide the future of everyone who had treated her as invisible, and in just a few hours that truth would land. No shouting required, just a signature. The hum of the aircraft engines pulsed like an artificial heartbeat, keeping the cabin in a state of manufactured normalcy. But for Naomi, every second of this so-called normal was being filed away as evidence. Seat 2B remained silent. The man beside her was absorbed in work, or pretending to be. He said nothing about Naomi being passed over for service and didn't ask why she had no towel, drink, or acknowledgement. He didn't object, but he didn't stand beside her either. That too was a choice. At that moment, Naomi had no idea a small moment would become the fault line between ordinary disdain and an unstoppable reckoning. A man in his 50s, designer polo luxury sports watch, of the kind only certain people recognize, approached from behind. He stood beside Naomi's seat, didn't look at her, but leaned toward Sloane and asked loudly enough for the entire row to hear, "Is she really in first class?" It didn't need an answer. It wasn't a question. It was denial disguised as surprise. Naomi didn't turn her head, didn't react. She had heard this tone 100 times in countless variations. Sloane squinted slightly, offering a faint, calculated smile, just polite enough to avoid offense, knowing sufficient to establish an alliance. "She's on the list, probably using miles or some old program." The man chuckled, tapped twice on Naomi's seat like testing cheap furniture, and walked away. Sloane said nothing else. She didn't have to. She thought the story had been sealed. But Naomi never forgets. She doesn't carry grudges, she keeps records. She opened her phone, kept the screen hidden, and launched a fingerprint-encrypted app, accessing the anonymous audit system, reserved for those in the merger deal's verifier role. Inside, she documented Sloane's behavior, sarcastic tone, inconsistent service, the male passenger's attitude, a public exclusionary remark, Seat 2B's silence, no violation but noted. She wasn't doing this out of anger. She was doing it because this was precisely why she had been placed here. Later, once the cabin had settled again, Naomi walked to the restroom unhurriedly and briefly. But as she returned to her seat, Sloane was already there, her demeanor shifting to a tone of performative professionalism. "Ms. Riley," Sloane said, loud enough for the row behind to hear, "the crew encourages passengers to limit movement during the flight, especially in the forward cabin." Naomi raised her head. "I was using the restroom." "Of course," Sloane nodded, "but frequent movement can make some passengers uncomfortable." Naomi paused briefly, not for lack of words, but to ensure each would land precisely. "Who's uncomfortable?" I can't disclose that. Then why ask me? Sloane blinked. She had no reply. Naomi sat down and buckled her seatbelt. I've flown before. I know the rules. Certainly. Sloane said, her voice no longer steady. The problem isn't that I broke a rule. Naomi continued, eyes on the window. The problem is that my presence makes people invent one. She said nothing more. But Sloane knew. She had exposed herself not through words, but by choosing who to serve and dismiss. Naomi leaned gently against the seat, eyes following the drifting clouds outside. There was no storm in the sky, but she knew the real turbulence had already begun. And this time it wasn't coming from above. It was rising from the ground, from the very people who believed they were in control, soon to be awakened by someone they had deliberately chosen not to see. The cabin shifted to descent mode. Flight attendants checked seatbelts, adjusted seats, and reminded passengers to stow bags. Everything appeared routine on the surface, but a silent shift had been triggered beneath it. Naomi felt it when she returned to her seat from a second restroom trip. Sloane's eyes weren't those of a flight attendant anymore. They were the eyes of someone who a superior had just briefed. She said nothing, just nodded stiffly. We recommend you minimize further movement. Naomi sat down and buckled up. No reaction, but she understood precisely what was happening. They had flagged her, not with a chime, not with paperwork, but with an internal code, aviation's quiet language for problem passengers. Code 37C, non-cooperative, not defiant but not instantly compliant, not disruptive but unwilling to conform. In the crew's earpieces, a new note had appeared: Passenger 2A hesitant to comply with crew instruction, monitored for further assessment. Naomi didn't need to hear it to know. She had worked in too many oversight systems not to recognize the signs of sanitized misclassification. The perfect irony is that she, sent as a covert monitor to evaluate premium passenger experience, is now being monitored by those unaware she holds the power to audit them. She didn't reach for her phone, but in her mind a protocol was activated. Step 1. Observe the language log for every omission. Step 2. Compare against first-class service standards. Step 3. Activate real-time behavioral monitoring. Before the flight, she had set up this evaluation protocol, a pilot program developed by Genesis Holdings to track customer interactions through ratings and verifiable data. When the plane touched down, Naomi remained seated, hand firm on the envelope. She didn't rush to stand. The seatbelt sign switched off, and passengers began grabbing overhead bags. Then, just as predicted, 2 uniformed men entered the cabin, not urgent, not aggressive, not police. They wore airport insignia earpieces and looked directly at row 2. Ms. Naomi Carter, yes. We've been asked to assist with verifying a few details of your itinerary. It will only take a few minutes. Naomi wasn't surprised. She didn't ask why. She stood, lifted her bag, tightened her grip on the envelope, as if to remind herself this wasn't an interrogation corridor. This was the final phase of the test. They led her through a side hallway used for staff or exceptional circumstances. They didn't touch her, didn't coerce. They presented the escort as customer assistants. But Naomi understood the truth. When a system wants to exclude you without reason, it renames your presence suspicious. They called it soft procedure. She called it documenting prejudice. A man in a black suit waited in a small room near the service gate. On the desk, his monitor already displayed Naomi's file seat ticket, and beneath it a red flag note: Passenger flagged possible behavioral concern. Non-escalated. Internal review pending. Naomi sat across from him, placing the unopened envelope on the desk. I know I've been flagged. It's not a red flag exactly, the man said, eyes still on the screen. It just needs further verification. Because I used the restroom. Because the system logged an unusual interaction with a crew member. Naomi smiled, not amused. Not bitter, but the smile of someone catching an old trick rebranded as something new. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small black card with no bank logo, just a barcode and a single serial number. She placed it beside the envelope. Verifier authorization issued by Genesis Holdings. What is this? It grants final authority to approve or halt the entire merger deal. If I am misclassified, the deal freezes. The man said nothing. He blinked. The screen in front of him was no longer his control panel. It was now a witness. Naomi nodded slowly. And if I was flagged based on bias rather than actual behavior, this isn't a system glitch. It's a political decision. The air inside the small room felt compressed. The man behind the desk could no longer maintain his neutral tone. His eyes drifted over Naomi's card on the table, a thin black rectangle with no chip or logo. Just a string of codes and an embedded barcode. No frontline staff had ever seen anything like it. He looked up. I've never seen this kind of card before. Naomi didn't judge him. Instead, she opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of thick paper watermark, stamped with Genesis Holdings insignia. At the top, it read, Discretionary Oversight Authorization Level 4, Strategic Compliance Access. At the bottom is a signature, followed by a note, Final Signatory Authority on all Genesis transactions in North American civil aviation. Naomi placed the sheet flat on the table, like sealing a verdict. This is why I'm here. I didn't come to fly. I came to observe how this company treats passengers it deems unimportant. The man Jennings, an airport ground operations supervisor, swallowed hard. He opened his laptop and typed rapidly. An internal call was made. No one in the room said a word. Naomi didn't need to. Her presence alone had forced the system to audit itself. Jennings set the phone down and exhaled. I've informed legal. Good. Naomi nodded. The sooner the clearer. Just then the door opened. A security officer entered, the same one who had escorted Naomi, alongside a woman in a black suit. Her expression unreadable. A badge marked Internal Risk was around her neck. Ms. Riley, the woman said evenly, we have just received confirmation from Genesis. You are under protected strategic operations. All internal behavior flags have been suspended. Naomi gave a short nod. Not just suspended. I request the full service log for Flight 1187 cabin camera footage, crew, interaction logs, and internal communication records throughout the flight. The woman hesitated for a beat. The request has been forwarded to the compliance unit. No, Naomi replied. Send it to me. She opened her phone, tapped an unnamed application, and verified with her fingerprint. A sleek grey dashboard lit up with silver borders and a notice verifier access activated. A new window opened, displaying the flight log, timestamps, crew assignments, internal notes, and synchronized video clips already being retrieved. Naomi looked up, locking eyes with Jennings. Every action today, from avoided eye contact, the skipped towel, to the question of fit, wasn't accidental. They reflect a layered system built on assumptions. I'm here to measure how deep that problem runs. For the first time, Jennings lost his composed tone. I didn't know who you were. No one in the system did. Exactly, Naomi said, because this test only works if I am considered worthless. She stood, looped her tote over her shoulder, and returned the envelope and card to their place. Just before stepping out, she turned back. I won't file a complaint. I won't call the media. I won't post a viral thread. She took a single step toward Jennings, gentle, but enough to make him shift in his seat. I will write an internal evaluation. And if that report shows this airline can't treat people fairly unless it knows who they are, it doesn't deserve the investment it's requesting. Naomi left the room, not with anger, but with the weight of something undeniable. She hadn't raised her voice and hadn't threatened. But every step she took through the airport corridors now caused nameplates to flicker. They no longer saw a black woman in the wrong place. They were now looking at someone who could redefine their place. Naomi exited the oversight room with a firm, not hurried stride. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The door behind her clicked shut like a period on the performative politeness the system had been staging throughout the flight. Her phone vibrated gently in her hand. A notification lit the screen. Genesis Command Internal Oversight, Sync Active, Automated Personnel Behavior, Tracking Activated. Naomi scanned her fingerprint. A verification code appeared. She tapped a single button. Begin full-line capture. Instantly, the internal system designed to respond in high-level audit scenarios began collecting data. Cabin camera footage from Flight 187. Crew radio communications. Check-in activity logs from Gate C9. Records of missed services, inconsistent interactions, and unacknowledged requests. Each data point was time-stamped and personnel tagged. No emotion, no blame, only facts. While Naomi walked toward the VIP lounge, a crisis meeting had already started in the Airport Operations Center's back office. On screen was a projected status alert, status risk review, active lead Naomi Carter, strategic level verifier, Genesis Holdings, subject potential discriminatory practices in premium flight services. Below were the names of key staff. Sloan Carter, lead flight attendant, Trent Maxwell, gate supervisor, Kelsey Monroe, check-in agent, Bryce Harper, cabin service manager. Someone in the room whispered, "She wasn't a passenger. She was the final sign-off for the merger deal." Another person set their pen down, voice tight, "And we just let it all expose itself." Meanwhile, Naomi continued walking. She didn't look back, but she knew the system behind her was no longer calm. She entered Genesis's secondary operations room, unlocked only when high-ranking personnel needed to observe field performance. Inside a modern control panel streamed synchronized video clips from the flight. Naomi sat down, activated the console with her clearance card, and played her first plane video boarding. She didn't blink as she saw Sloan pass her without a word, greeting a towel or acknowledgement. Following clip, Kelsey, at gate C9, whispering to a colleague, "Probably the wrong gate. Doesn't look like first class." Naomi didn't react. She just tagged the clip. Discriminatory tone, flagged. On a secondary screen, the service log appeared. Every moment Naomi skipped a meal drink or greeting was highlighted in red. 2A, no meal selection recorded. 2A, no towel service. 2A, no verbal engagement from lead attendant, all annotated with a warning. Service pattern irregularity, requires ethical review. Upstairs in the airline executive suite, an email appeared on 3 monitors at once. Notice from Genesis Holdings, merger contract approval, suspended pending Flight 1987 behavior audit completion. Full report due within 48 hours. Beneath that, a single line, when a system mistreats people, it's not the protocol that gets punished, it's the structure that gets re-examined. Someone looked up from the email, exhaling. She didn't need to raise her voice, but every step she took was a verdict. In the control room, Naomi continued tagging the footage. No anger, no bitterness. She knew. Anger fades. Emotion subsides, but data remains. And the system will have to answer with words, with actions, with reform. She opened the final tab of the draft of her internal report. The title she typed, Memo on an Invisible Passenger, and the reflection of a non-neutral system. She paused, eyes lifting to the tarmac beyond the glass. The sun was rising, casting light over aircraft preparing for takeoff. Naomi smiled softly, not because she had won, but she had forced the entire system to look at itself without mirrors or disguises. Conference Room 6A, the executive floor of the airport, had never been this crowded on a midweek afternoon. Beneath the harsh white lights, familiar faces were present: flight attendants, check-in agents, cabin supervisors, service team leaders. They used to command first-class cabins. Now they were summoned for precisely the thing they once commanded. At the head of the table stood Lisa Halverson, a representative of the airline's Human Resources Oversight Board. Her hair was neatly tied, her face unreadable, and she held a thick dossier in her hand. She said, "We're not here to make excuses. We're here to compare facts. What happened on Flight 11 and 87 is no longer a personal lapse. It reflects a systemic behavioral pattern." The large screen behind Lisa lit up. A video clip from the cabin camera began to play flight attendant Sloan walking past row 2 without offering a towel. She smiled at passengers in row 1 and chatted with those in row 3, but skipped over Naomi's seat as if it were unoccupied. No one in the room spoke. Sloan stared at the footage, lips pressed, but no words came. Lisa tapped a button. The following clip appeared. Naomi presented her first-class ticket at the boarding gate, only to be told by staff member Kelsey that executive platinum guests only were allowed to board early despite the ticket reading 2A first class. A chair creaked. Kelsey lowered her head, hands clenched. "No one here is being accused of overt discrimination," Lisa said, calm but echoing off the walls. "But we need to clarify this. How did every standard service protocol, towels, drinks, menu options, greetings, just happen to be skipped for one passenger? Simultaneously, no response, no defense." Lisa reached for a page from the file. "We've received a full log from Genesis Holdings, including audio recordings of internal cabin conversations." She read aloud, "Passenger 2A, not sure they're first class. Doesn't look it. Probably used miles-old system. She's been to the restroom twice. Feels unusual." Lisa looked up. "You think these were just casual remarks? To them, this is evidence of a culture hidden behind professional smiles." No one argued, because truth doesn't need defending once it's captured in data. In another meeting room, one level higher, a call was directly connected to Genesis Holdings' executive office. A clear male voice came through. "We confirm that Naomi Carter is the sole legally authorized decision-maker for the ongoing merger. And we confirm that the deal will be suspended until this airline proves it can deliver equitable and transparent customer service." The room fell silent. That final sentence hung like a sword over the company's financial operation. Sloan received her temporary reassignment at the staff lounge. No international routes. No more first-class service. Shifted to short-haul domestic flights. Note, undergoing service behavior retraining. She reached the last line and her heart sank. Temporary, pending re-evaluation. No guarantee of return to former position. She knew the only thing missing from that paper was the woman's silence she once ignored. At gate B8, where short domestic flights departed, Sloan stood in line with other attendants. Her uniform, still crisp, hair still neat, but her expression no longer bore the confidence of someone commanding first class. A voice called from behind Ms. Sloan. She turned. Naomi Carter stood there, as simple as the morning she walked into the terminal. No entourage, no heels, no title needed. Just a steady gaze, calm, but razor-sharp. "You once said I didn't belong in first class," Naomi said softly. "You were right." Sloan opened her mouth to respond. Naomi continued, "I didn't come to sit in first class. I came to assess whether it deserves to exist." Sloan froze, the apology stuck in her throat like a stone. Naomi gave a slight nod and walked away. No need for a reply, because an entire system had just been forced to look in the mirror and could no longer turn away. 2 weeks after the Flight 11 and 87 incident, a closed-door meeting occurred on the top floor of Genesis Holdings the investment group holding majority shares in 3 of North America's largest airlines. Inside the room, the lighting was muted purposefully so. No wall art preaching vision or empty slogans. Just a single screen displaying 2 lines: Review Protocol, Passenger Experience, and Bias Matrix, Lead N. Carter. Strategic Architecture Division. Naomi entered, without fanfare, without introduction. Everyone present already knew who she was, but not everyone knew her new role. She was no longer the verifier, no longer the observer. She was redesigning the evaluation framework for human conduct in public service systems. We spent decades creating procedures that look fair, Naomi began, voice soft but unwavering. But the issue isn't in the documents. It lies with those who choose to ignore the lines in between. She clicked. The screen changed to slide 2, a top-down visual of an aircraft cabin, with every crew action marked by color. Green for proper procedure, yellow for behavior showing bias potential, red for explicit discriminatory conduct. It resembled a silent crime map. We cannot change people if we don't change what we measure. She introduced PX1, Passenger Experience Integrity, a new metric. It combined AI and anonymous interaction tracking to score service quality based on real passenger experiences, not self-assessments or hollow customer surveys. What made it unique? The metric would anonymize the passenger but expose the system. It didn't matter who you were. What mattered was how the system treated you when it assumed you were no one. A board member, the CEO of a major airline, asked if we implement this. What's to stop employees from becoming robotic out of fear of being rated? Naomi smiled without sarcasm and pointedly replied, "So up until now, fear was the only reason they behaved correctly." The room fell silent. If an attendant is only kind when they know the passenger has power, she continued, they're not fit to serve. 1 week later, Genesis formally mandated PX1 as a required performance index across all airline investments. No compliance, no funding approval. Change began quietly but deeply. Training sessions focused on unlearning bias-conditioned behavior. Any passenger could now be a silent experience verifier. Every service action was digitized not for punishment, but for early correction. Naomi declined all interviews. She stayed off camera, wrote no books, spoke at no conferences. She didn't need to be recognized because she had survived being unseen. Instead, she continued working from her modest office, designing new behavioral frameworks for banking, healthcare, and education sectors. Anywhere people were served based on perception instead of truth. One day, while waiting for a business flight, Naomi overheard a gate attendant say to an elderly black passenger, "I'm sorry to keep you waiting, sir. Today I'm here to serve you, not to judge you." Naomi looked up. She didn't know the young woman, had no connection to her, but she smiled because she didn't need everyone to know who she was. She only needed them to understand that no one has the right to treat another human being as invisible.